So today marks the 5th straight day since Russia launched its offensive against Ukraine. Now, before we get you the details, let's quickly get you the top developments that have happened at this hour. The Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has agreed to hold talks with Russia at the Chernobyl exclusion zone. This after Volodymyr Zelensky has held talks with Belarus's Alexander Lukashenko, while the Ukrainian president remains skeptical, saying that he does not believe in an outcome for the meeting. Zelensky has also said that he is also willing to try and speak to Russia.
Скажу відверто, як завжди, я не дуже вірю в результат цієї зустрічі, але нехай спробують. Щоб потім у жодного громадянина України не було жодного сумніву, що я, як президент, не намагався зупинити війну, коли був нехай і маленький, але все ж таки шанс.
Meanwhile, Belarus in a referendum has decided to go nuclear and drop its non-nuclear status. The new constitution could see nuclear weapons on Belarusian soil for the very first time since the country gave them up after the fall of the Soviet Union. The West has said it will not recognize this particular vote. Lukashenko has said that he could of course ask Russia to return nuclear weapons to Belarus, and also the decision has now sparked anti-war protests in several cities. Meanwhile, the Russian President Vladimir Putin has also ordered his military to put deterrence forces, that is the nuclear deterrence forces, on high alert. The announcement, however, does not mean that Russia intends to use the nuclear weapons, but this is a statement that has caused a lot of concern amongst the West. The West, of course, has slammed Putin's decision to put its nuclear deterrence forces on standby. The NATO chief has blasted Russia's move, calling it as very dangerous and irresponsible talk, while the British Prime Minister Boris Johnson has accused Vladimir Putin of putting nuclear forces on alert to distract the ground realities as they are unfolding in Ukraine. Meanwhile, the United Nations Security Council has now voted to hold a rare emergency meeting of the UNGA, with about 11 countries voting to hold the meet. Russia voted against the draft, while 3 countries, including India, China and the United Arab Emirates, chose to abstain from the vote.
It is regrettable that the situation in Ukraine, we reiterate our call for immediate cessation of violence or apocalypse.
All right, now to give us more insights in terms of how this conflict is likely to play out, we are joined by Mr. Stephen Golub, who's an international affairs expert. He's joining us live from California. And we're also joined by Irina Sukuman, who's the CEO of Scarab Rising, a media and security consultancy from New York. Now, Irina, let me begin with you. Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, has said that the next 24 hours are going to be crucial. He's willing to talk with the Russians. Do you see any kind of a result coming out of these talks?
No, I do not. I don't think Russia is ready for any good faith negotiations yet. I think Putin still believes he can take Kyiv and other major cities in Ukraine, and so long as he is motivated by aggression and so long as he still thinks he can get what he wants, he has no incentive to really come to negotiating tables where he would be surely be forced to consider making painful sacrifices. Unfortunately, that is not. This is a good faith gesture on the side of President Zelensky, and it's an opportunity for both sides to use a potential ceasefire, to use a potential discussion as an opportunity to reevaluate their own priorities, but it's not going to change the situation, not by itself.
Right, that's interesting that you've said this. Mr. Golub, if I can bring you in on this. Now, what is interesting is that in the last few hours, we've also heard from the Russian President Vladimir Putin, who's now put Russia's nuclear deterrence forces on alert. You know, what message is Vladimir Putin trying to send across? On the one hand, he has shown a certain willingness to, of course, negotiate, but on the other, he's also put his nuclear deterrence forces on alert. What are we to read into this?
Well, I think we could read it on 2 levels. On one level, he's inadvertently sending a message that he's irresponsible and perhaps even unstable in how he's handling this crisis. The move to go into Ukraine, the move to invade Ukraine, was foolish to begin with. He's now elicited reactions from a number of analysts, 3 top U.S. officials who don't usually speak in such terms, calling him either unhinged or having gone off the rails. So this tactic may not be the product of any really well thought out strategy, but just Vladimir Putin trying to up the ante. If you're going to look for some semblance of a strategy, though, he may be trying to simply intimidate the U.S. and NATO into backing down or withholding support it otherwise might have been providing. And he also might have done this conceivably for his domestic audience. If the U.S. were to reply by going on a greater into a greater state of nuclear readiness, then he could say, look, this is now a fight between us and the U.S. It's not simply a matter of Ukraine, not a fight that he intends to really go nuclear about, but it's a way of trying, it may be one of several ways of trying to get more domestic support on his side for a war that he'll eventually win in some way, but is not going well at all so far.
And also, what do you make of this, this vote in Belarus stating that it would like to have nuclear arms back onto its territory? Is that something that the West should be very concerned about?
Certainly somewhat concerned. I think my guess, and it's only that, is that this is kind of a piece with, or along the lines of Putin elevating the nuclear readiness or threat level, that it's another way of saying to the West, look, we're going to become a more dangerous power to deal with, or we've got a threat of being more dangerous if you don't back down. I don't think it's going to work because I think the West is, and not just the West, much of the world community, I hope eventually, including India, will stand up for some basic principles such as you simply can't invade in other countries, a neighboring country's territory on some obscure pretext. India, I mention India specifically because you've justifiably got concerns about China next door, and China could view this as a precedent for further attempts at incursions into India territory. But to get back to your question, I think that this is a cause for concern. How much concern will depend on whether Russia actually goes through with it and other things to follow, but I don't see this as the beginning or a step towards nuclear war.
All right, interesting that you mentioned that. Ms. Zuckerman, if I can bring you in on this. As things stand on the ground, Russia on the very first day made some pretty good headway in terms of the invasion that it was carrying out. It was on the gates of Kyiv, but since then, it seems to have lost a bit of its momentum in the war that is waging in Ukraine. Is the war going badly for Russia at this point of time?
I think the war is not just going badly. It's already a complete embarrassment for Putin, who revealed multiple security vulnerabilities, who revealed himself not to be in control of the situation, who underestimated his enemy, which is the worst thing you can do during a war, who launched a war that was poorly thought out and is already backfiring on Russia in more levels than Putin ever thought likely or possible. And he revealed himself a weak ally. One of the reasons why India and UAE were left on the sidelines, were left abstaining from taking a decision either way, is because they are still on the fence on which direction to fully commit to. UAE has had its share of concerns about U.S. commitments, to be sure, and has been exploring opportunities to do business with Russia, whereas India has a long history of strong relations with Russia and only fairly recently has started shifting dramatically towards alliance with the West. And so both countries have been in an awkward position of having to make decisions. And Russia has projected a great deal of power, of strength, of being a reliable ally, and try to contrast itself with the US, where the power changes every 4 years and where there's been a great deal of polarization and lack of commitment to a foreign policy course, which caused a great deal of consternation in these countries. But Putin has discredited himself to such an extent by starting a war with no real grounding, by showing himself to be both a threat and someone who is not capable of carrying out the very issues he started. And he is not going to be helpful to these countries. I think in the future you will see them changing their minds with respect to Russia.
Absolutely interesting. It'll be interesting to see as to which way diplomacy, of course, turns. But Mr. Golub, looking at how the conflict has gone on so far and also the West's reaction, do you feel that the West has in fact let Ukraine down in terms of how it has responded to this invasion by the Russians? Clearly, the West has said no NATO troops will be put on the ground to in some ways create any kind of deterrence for Russia against Ukraine. But even in terms of sanctions that have been imposed, these have been individual nations that have been imposing sanctions and financial costs on Russia. We still haven't heard of United Nations sanctions on Russia.
Well, I think it's a good question. It's a complicated answer that I'll try to make short. I think in hindsight, with the wisdom of hindsight, perhaps the NATO and the U.S. and other allies could have provided even more advanced military support, not in terms of troops on the ground, but equipment to Ukraine leading up to this. There were reasons in terms of caution not to do so, but they did supply quite a bit in terms of the U.S. alone, I think $650 million worth of armaments. But on balance, I'd say the U.S. and the other allies have handled this pretty well. They've come up with, they are prepared to provide more military support if the Ukrainian forces can hold out long enough, or if an insurgency starts, which it probably will, if Russia even takes over, when Russia probably takes over the country. But also the economic sanctions have really been more coordinated than perhaps your question indicated. There's been a lot of negotiations, but it's led to some significant steps, including cutting off major Russian banks from an international system for moving money, and also putting some really severe restrictions on the Russian central bank, its ability to access funds overseas. And those, along with other sanctions, I really do think are taking a bite and will take a bite out of the Russian economy, and perhaps out of support for President Putin, both in the grassroots and in elite circles going forward.
All right, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed to both Stephen Golub and also to Arina Tuskaman for joining us on this broadcast on WION and giving us your perspective in terms of how this conflict in Ukraine is, of course, heading.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
WION is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news on the move.